Welcome, everyone. Today, we have the pleasure of meeting Professor Jessica Auchter. Professor Auchter is Research Chair in Visual Culture in International Studies and full professor at Université Laval, au Quebec. Her research is on visual culture and politics. Her current research program is on the visual representation of atrocity and corpses and human rights in international studies. Professor Auchter is the author of Global Course Politics, The Obscenity Taboo in 2021, and The Politics of Haunting and Memory in International Relations, 2014, and dozens of articles and book chapters in scholarly journals like Critical Studies on Security and the Journal of Global Security Studies, to name only a few. She is the recipient of the International Studies Association's Fred Hartman Prize for her research on undocumented immigrants who die crossing the US-Mexico border. Professor Auchter is also an associate editor of the Journal of International Political Sociology and a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Narrative Politics. And if that is not enough, she sits on the Governing Council of the International Studies Association Northeast. Today, Professor Auchter is here to discuss understanding sexual violence against men during civil war as a strategic tactic. On behalf of the Center for International and Defense Policy and its director, Senator Hugh Siegel, I would like to welcome Professor Auchter to Queen's University.
Thank you so much. Hopefully my microphone is working. All right. Okay. Cue this up. Technology is always the most complicated portion. Oh, there we go. Okay. So today I'm going to talk to you a bit about an ongoing research project that originated in an interest I've had for many years on the intersections between gender and assumptions we make about vulnerability, who counts as vulnerable in international politics, particularly in international justice mechanisms and a variety of other contexts. And so I've done a bit of work on sort of different dimensions of this problem, and the dimension that I want to discuss with you today is the context of sexual violence against men in the context of civil wars and ethnic cleansing. Oh, there we go. Okay. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about two cases to highlight a few different key points. The case of civil war in Syria and the case of ethnic cleansing in Myanmar. And there's 3 points that I want to sort of address today to kind of highlight the contours of this research project and some of the questions that I'm raising. The first is that sexual violence is complicated. And one of the dilemmas of engaging in a project like this that draws attention to sexual violence against men is how to avoid falling into the trap of some sort of men's rights activists who suggest that violence against men should be considered more important than violence against women. It has been a widespread issue of this project and in different audiences where I've discussed the project. So the first point that I want to highlight is that our relationship to femininity, or the structures or hierarchies associated with vulnerability and femininity, are key to properly understanding sexual violence, whether it is against men or against women. So today I want to talk about the procedures of emasculation that exist in the context of sexual violence against men, but we can't consider that as separate from some of the same mechanisms of community destruction that are at the heart of sexual violence against women also. So while I'll make the point today that some of the strategic logic functions a little bit differently when it comes to sexual violence against men, the underlying relationship between masculinity and femininity and the hierarchy of values associated with it is part of the same logic or process. So that is to say that I want to argue that a feminist framework that sort of acknowledges this relationship and these assumptions that underpin how we think of masculinity and vulnerability, or femininity and vulnerability, is essential to properly understanding these dynamics. And I'll say a little bit about this, but I think Sexual violence against men specifically is a form of emasculation that seeks to feminize victims and render them in a position that is in contradistinction to typical masculine values or ideals. And I think the functioning of these stereotypes is really important to understanding why there hasn't been as much attention to understanding this strategic logic. The other point that I want to make is that this kind of assumptions that we make about masculinity and vulnerability, that men are less likely to be vulnerable, especially to this type of violence, really structures the lack of data that we have on this subject, which has been the biggest obstacle to engaging this project. So you see here a quote associated with a non-governmental organization in Lebanon that has worked with Syrian refugees, and they say men are just seen as perpetrators and allies. So it's a big dilemma for male victims to achieve proper redress, judicial and otherwise. It's hard enough for female victims of sexual violence, but there is an added layer of these stereotypical assumptions at play here that make it difficult for men to be considered as victims. And perpetrators rely on some of these taboos when they engage in that violence. So that's kind of the third point I want to make, is that the choice to utilize sexual violence in the specific context that I'm looking at is often a strategic choice. What that means is that perpetrators rely on the existence of particular taboos, particular assumptions to purposely dismantle community structures. They also rely on taboos that might label male victims of violence as gay in order to enact this violence and ensure that it disrupts the bonds of communities and has lingering social and community-based effects. So those are kind of the three dimensions of what I want to talk about today. Let's see if. Do I have to? Oh, okay, great. All right. So just to highlight the context a little bit, as I mentioned, sometimes sexual violence against men and boys can manifest a little bit differently than sexual violence against women. Some of the dimensions that we typically see are forced sex acts on others. This is quite common in the context of ethnic-related violence or genocide, particularly against family members, because of the aims of disrupting community bonds, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. We often also see castration or forcible sterilization, genital beatings or electric shocks, which are quite common in a detention-based setting, where men are detained, like by the Syrian government, for example. You often see deliberate violence or trauma that is designed to impair fertility. And I'll talk a little bit about the kind of continuation of a bloodline that is part of ethnic-related violence in this context. And then what we often might think of as being more typical forms of sexual violence, like object insertion or person-on-person rape by penetration. And as I said, in detention centers, we see particular degrees of vulnerability. The reason why I want to highlight some of these dimensions associated with this type of violence is that often sexual violence against men manifests as physical beatings against the genitals. And the reason why that's important is that by many different mechanisms of international and local justice, it's not coded as sexual violence. And this is a huge dilemma for properly addressing this. And it's only in the last several years that we're seeing certain historical cases be revisited and reinterpreted to try to gather more accurate data. So I said at the beginning that accurate data is one of the most difficult components of this kind of project. There have been widespread studies of rape as a tool of civil war, an excellent book by Dara K. Cohen, but she articulates in it that there may be these same kind of mechanisms related to sexual violence against men, but there's just no data. The positive thing is that in the last couple of years, we're starting to see a bit more. There's been a revisiting of the Bosnian genocide, and we're seeing a lot more stories emerge from that case associated with it. But I think the biggest dilemma is that when this type of violence occurs, it isn't coded as sexual violence, it's coded as torture. This is true of a lot of different types of this sort of violence. It's true at a lot of different levels of prosecution, ranging from the International Criminal Court and these kind of transnational mechanisms to more local level mechanisms, truth and justice commissions, and that sort of thing. So if you look at the truth commissions that emerged out of El Salvador and Peru, when they first published their reports, they suggested that 1% of the victims of sexual violence in El Salvador and 2% in Peru were men. So 2% of the victims were men. After several years passed and the data was sort of revisited, and they started to redefine what actually counts as sexual violence versus torture, they determined that the actual numbers were closer to 50% in El Salvador and 22% in Peru. So a lot of this comes down to how we actually define sexual violence, and this has been a big obstacle for me in some of the work I've done in the past of what actually constitutes sexual violence, what actually constitutes gender-based violence, and the definitions become a lot more complicated when you're talking about something like genital beatings or something along those lines. So the coding of sexual violence as torture becomes a big dilemma and also makes it more difficult for men to seek appropriate mechanisms of justice or even psychological assistance within the services that are provided in a post-conflict setting. So the definitions matter a lot, except they're also kind of fuzzy. And that causes a bit of an issue. Okay. So the first case that I want to talk about to highlight this is the Syrian case, where most of the sexual violence that occurs is in a detention-based context. But not only that, we also see sexual violence as a tactic used by ISIS, both against women and against men. A focus group of refugee women in Jordan estimated that 30 to 40% of all adult men had experienced sexual violence while in detention. There's some other interviews with men and women that have suggested that the number could be more like 99%. So some suggest that almost no male in detention in Syria has escaped some forms of sexual violence. Again, it all depends on how it's defined. So often the victims of this type of violence don't define what has happened to them as sexual violence. So these types of surveys and focus groups, it's sometimes difficult to kind of properly understand the statistics that are coming out. But despite that, even a statistic like 30 to 40% is quite high. There's also some other studies that were conducted that suggest this might be a more pervasive issue, even outside of detention. In 2013, a study showed that 10% of Syrian male youth, ages 12 to 24, had experienced an incident of sexual harm in the previous 3 months, which is sort of quite high. And we also see a huge issue with vulnerability of refugee communities, because in refugee camps, for a wide variety of reasons, there are lower social costs to rape of boys than rape of girls. Because girls' virginity is considered so culturally sacred, the social cost of perpetrating rape against a girl is quite a lot higher, whereas the cost is considered lower against boys. Additionally, because there's not a lot of sexual education, especially in a refugee camp setting, boys are not always aware of what's appropriate or inappropriate. So you often see a higher risk of vulnerability, actually, of boys in a refugee camp setting to sexual violence than you do even of girls, which is something a bit unusual. And it's sort of strange to think about this, that rape of a boy is considered less reputationally harmful than rape of a girl, but that's what we're seeing in refugee camps in Lebanon and Jordan related to the Syrian conflict. And as we know, refugees in general are more vulnerable because of their precarious legal status or their precarious employment status, so that can increase the vulnerability, both for women and men, or girls and boys. And as you see, the perpetrators are primarily the Syrian government in detention centers, but you're also seeing this utilized as a tactic where gang rapes are often undertaken of new recruits. This was a phenomenon related to ISIS recruitment. One of the things that has been demonstrated with sexual violence against women in a civil war context, especially when it's carried out by military or militia members, is that we see higher incidences of gang rape as opposed to individually carried out rapes. And the reason for that is that it is a kind of mechanism of promoting unit cohesion. It's a little bit disturbing to think of it in those terms, but the idea is that if members of a unit are participating in an act together, the more taboo that act is, the more likely they are to kind of create a community out of being part of a same sort of extreme or taboo act. It also makes it much harder to report on one another if the entire group is participating in the act. So one thing that we see is among militia perpetrated rapes during civil war, we see much higher incidences of gang rape than we see in other contexts. So it's a unique feature of civil war. And from the limited data that we have on the context where we're looking at specifically men being targeted, we see very similar sorts of things. We're more likely to see gang rapes or sort of groups of perpetrators in this context as well. So we have data that shows that that's the case with regards to female victims during a civil war context, and the limited data that we have that's coming out of some of these cases seems to suggest the same thing with regards to men. Sorry. Okay, here we go. In the last several years, we are trying to get a bit more data, and most of it is coming out of focus groups, small level sort of surveys that are happening by grassroots organizations. In the Syrian context, there were some focus groups that were done in Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq by the UNHCR to kind of focus on this issue. So I've put up a few quotes so that you can kind of understand what some of the victims are saying themselves. The first kind of highlights some of the stigma associated with it. A man would never speak of this, but partly because of the stigma, but also because it's sufficiently commonplace that everybody knows it is sort of that it's widespread and that it's happening to everyone. So what's the point of actually sort of discussing it? So this kind of violence has become normalized in the detention context in Syria. You can see from the second that the individual is afraid to report it to a doctor because he's afraid of the stigma associated with homosexuality. So especially when it comes to penetration types of sexual violence, this is a widespread fear. But anytime you see male perpetrators and male victims in a community context where homosexuality is stigmatized, you see this type of fear. And it is a valid fear because there have been cases where people have been stigmatized, have been shunned from their own communities as a result of being victims of this type of violence. In some of these focus groups, the discussion that emerges is that many of these refugees perceive that it's impossible for men to be raped by men. And so, again, you start to see this inability to think of men as vulnerable in particular ways, partly because that vulnerability is inherently feminizing. So if you admit that you have been a victim of sexual violence, then you're also admitting that there's been a wound to your own masculinity, and it disrupts the entire structures of what it means to be masculine. And since that's equated with strength, in many contexts with qualified political participation, with qualified membership in certain communities, to admit that you are a victim of this type of violence requires the complete rupture in your understanding of masculinity. And many refugees articulate this either as it's impossible for a man to be raped, which makes it difficult for them to understand what's happened to them, or that they don't want to share anything about what's happened to them, that they enter depressive states because they feel like their masculinity is completely lost. Also, non-victims often use language like men would never let themselves be raped, they would fight to the death. So there's an assumption that if someone was in this situation, they must have allowed it. The victim blaming that we often see with women as well. And with female victims of this type of violence, many times their husbands will leave them because they allow themselves to be a victim. We see something similar in this case where men are judged by other men in their community for allowing themselves to become victims. So the assumption is if you didn't fight to the death, then you must have wanted it. And that's where the invocation of homosexuality or sexual tendencies comes into play. So you can see why the structures are created where men might not want to admit that this context occurred. In terms of the effects in the Syrian case, aside from the immediate physical effects of this type of violence, which are ongoing pain and other physical issues, you'll obviously see psychological trauma. Sometimes boys will leave school. Sometimes you'll see death threats associated or targeted towards victims because of what they've been through. You often see economic marginalization, or because people are depressed, they're unable to engage economically and vibrantly in the way they would normally be able to. It's already hard enough in a refugee camp to make a livelihood, but if you have ongoing psychological trauma from what happened to you in detention, it's even more difficult. And there have been several cases of women who have divorced their husbands as a result of their victimization in these kinds of contexts. Also, sometimes their family members, like their daughters, are considered unmarriageable because of what happened to the fathers. So it has widespread family implications. That some refugees suggest that it could destroy the entire family if the kind of victimization is publicized. So I want to highlight this because in a detention context, you often see, especially when it's this widespread, you have to ask yourself what the purpose of engaging in this type of violence is. And that's why I think the Civil War context is so important, because what you're seeing is a deliberate attempt to dismantle the communities by engaging in this type of violence. And in many cases, the undermining of traditional norms of masculinity, however we may find criticisms of those traditional norms of masculinity, which I think are fair criticisms, but the deliberate undermining of some of those traditional norms and the deliberate emasculation of individuals that are detained has purposeful, widespread social effects. So the social effects and community effects it has aren't accidental. They're deliberate attempts to dismantle a sort of dissident group that's fighting the government by government actors. At least that's what I posit, right? And gathering evidence for this is a little bit more difficult, but it's difficult to understand the motivations for these processes without thinking through some of the strategic motivations. So there haven't been a lot of questions asked about how we can properly understand these strategic motivations. So I'll just say it's a tentative conclusion from the project so far, but what I want to emphasize is it's important to be asking the question about the ways in which this is a strategic choice. First, we have to actually pay attention to the violence, and then we have to assess it in a strategic lens. So the UNHCR report that came out of some of this focus group data highlights some of the dilemmas associated with why we haven't seen more attention to this issue. So this is from 2017 from the UNHCR report. And you can see that the problem is that the non-governmental organizations that work on the ground with survivors of sexual and gender-based violence don't have appropriate procedures to adequately address male victims. In many cases, and this isn't just a Syrian problem, this is widespread. In many cases, when people come to seek services, there's forms, and the forms are very explicitly targeted at female victims. What were you penetrated with in your vagina? These types of questions are asked by groups that are providing services. So if you're a male victim of sexual violence and the first encounter you have with these kinds of mechanisms, which are often also the best data gathering mechanisms that we have for understanding these dynamics, if your first encounter suggests that you are not a typical victim, or perhaps that you're not even a victim that's entitled to these services in the first place, that can be a big issue. The other mechanisms that I discussed, the stigma associated with homosexuality, the larger social stigma, and other sorts of things associated with that also cause issues. And then also the sort of myth that men can't be raped, which persists within these societies, and pretty much every society that I've examined associated with this, including our own. And I think the lack of data is important, but the lack of data, it's sort of a vicious cycle. Because the structures are not in place to adequately cope with male victims of violence, we don't have great data on it. And because we don't have great data on it, the mechanisms of redress haven't revisited the issue to try to better deal with this class of victims. So it's mutually reinforcing, and that's why we're sort of stuck in this cycle. Okay, the other context and case I want to talk about is the Myanmar case, because I think there's something important to understand about the specifically ethnic dimensions of certain types of civil war, civil conflict, or ethnic cleansing, and specifically the intersections between racial or ethnic violence and sexual violence. And there's a long history of rape as a tool of genocide or a tool of ethnic cleansing. Fertility is often described as threatening in an ethnic context. It persists in other contexts as well. And there's sort of stereotypes that certain types of people are just reproducing too much, and that is in and of itself a threat. So reproduction becomes perceived as threatening, but in an ethnic context, this takeover of families that are having large numbers of children is perceived as directly threatening. And we see this in rhetoric in Myanmar for, it has been the case for many years that we see this. But the perception, especially that the Rohingya have larger quantities of children than other ethnic groups in Myanmar. So when we see sexual violence used as a tactic, especially against women, often it is designed to disrupt the bloodline. And we see this during the Bosnian genocide. Perpetrators who raped Bosnian women would say things like, "You're going to give birth to a Serb baby," or something like that. This idea that by implanting a child of a different ethnic group in you, we're going to disrupt the continuation of this ethnic group. So this connections with fertility, with reproduction, with bloodlines have always been at the heart of certain types of sexual violence, especially against women, in the context of ethnic cleansing and genocide. Also, sexual violence is sometimes used to denote the end of intergroup relationships. So often in the immediate context before genocide or ethnic cleansing, you see more pressure on people who have inter-ethnic relationships to end those relationships, to move away, or something along those lines. So inter-ethnic relationships themselves become a threat. Often sexual violence is perceived as a way to sort of end this inter-ethnic relationship or the trend of inter-ethnic relationships. In Kenya, in post-election violence that is taken on ethnic casts, we sometimes see this occurring, where if there is an inter-ethnic marriage, well, it depends on who the perpetrator groups of the violence are, but the perpetrators force one of the individuals to engage in more extreme forms of violence to prove that they're a worthy member of their own ethnic group. At times, people have been forced to watch their spouse be raped, usually in this case women, but not always, as a means of sort of defining the end of this inter-ethnic relationship. So all of that is to say, sexual violence is a potent tool for kind of denoting these forms of ethnic violence, and for marking the otherness of victim groups. There's also, in the context of the genocide in Kosovo, Albanians were cited as particularly threatening because they had really high birth rates, and Milosevic said it was a form of sexual aggression. So all of these sorts of rhetoric that's utilized associated with this. So there is a connection between the racial and ethnic dynamics, this kind of racial othering or ethnic othering, and kind of foreignness, and then also this kind of larger sexual politics. And that's why we also often see family members being forced to commit sexual violence against one another as a means to sort of disrupt these community boundaries. There's also a sort of larger, well, maybe I'll just go ahead and talk about it in a minute, that the case of family member rape is particularly important for properly understanding ethnic violence. I'll postpone that for a minute and talk about it specifically in the Myanmar case. Okay. So I don't have a lot of time to talk about the background of this particular case. So I'll just say that there's a long history of persecution against the Rohingya in Myanmar because they're considered to be foreigners and not real citizens. And most of the violence is carried out by the Tatmadaw, the military in Myanmar, which also possesses the political levers of power in that country. There's a small number of cases carried out by Rakhine men, which is the region where this violence is primarily carried out, but the vast majority is by the military. There's been systematic targeting of women and girls, specifically of reproductive age, so widespread sexual violence against women. There's been attacks on pregnant women, killing of children, mutilation of reproductive organs for women. So there's widespread sexual violence in the cast of ethnic violence that I just mentioned. And in a lot of cases, men have left their wives for allowing themselves to be raped by someone who wasn't Muslim. So there's the social stigma that exists also. But one thing that I think is interesting is as a result of some of the dynamics in the last couple of years related to as a result of the military coup and a couple of other dynamics in the last couple of years, we've seen more defectors from the Myanmar military that have come out and started to share some insights about how the Tatmadaw actually functions, which it was previously a fairly closed-off organization. So many of these defectors have articulated the way in which rape and gang rape especially is used as a mechanism of unit cohesion in the Tatmadaw. Not only that this kind of idea of militarized masculinity is premised almost entirely on the othering of certain ethnic groups. So not everyone in the Tatmadaw is a member of the dominant ethnic group in Myanmar. There's a fair number of members who are part of minority ethnic groups that have themselves been targeted by the government of Myanmar. But it is almost, the evidence that we have right now suggests that many of those minority ethnic members of the Tatmadaw are kind of like being taught to be swept up in some of this, in some of these ethnic othering through participation in sexual violence. Sexual violence as a strategic tactic to promote unit cohesion and also to essentially ensure that many minority ethnic groups become part of the larger mission of the Myanmar government rather than resisting to it. So it's not just unit cohesion, it's also a mechanism of kind of reshaping ethnic identity and what it means in the country. And it's only recently that we're beginning to really understand what some of those dynamics look like within the military. I've already mentioned that most of the cases involve gang rape because of the extreme taboo nature of it. The thing I think is interesting in this case is we do see widespread sexual violence against women. That often sexual violence against women in a Civil War context is understood using this classic spoils of war kind of argument. Well, the men were away from their families and the women were just there. The thing is, in ethnic violence, that's a lot more complicated because the victim group is painted as literally disgusting and in many cases inhuman. The arguments by representatives of the government of Myanmar have suggested that the statistics about sexual violence can't possibly be true because the Rohingya are too disgusting to be raped, that their women are literally too ugly to be raped. So this kind of suggests that women are only raped because of sexual attraction, but it minimizes this idea that rape against women in Myanmar is used as a tactic to disrupt bloodlines, to disrupt ethnic identity. And we're starting to see more information coming out that suggests that many of the same dynamics exist with regards to sexual violence against men in this context. Yes. So it serves the same end, but with a slightly different dynamic, right? Because it's not intended to disrupt bloodlines to the same extent, although sometimes genital beatings can and do impair fertility. In this case, instead what we're seeing is the attempt to emasculate the members of this community to disrupt the social cohesion bonds of this ethnic group. So when I say that sexual violence against men is a strategic tactic, it is a strategic tactic in much of the same way as a strategic tactic when adopted against women. But the ethnic dimension, I think, sheds light a little bit more on the intersections between sexual violence and ethnic violence, and the way in which disruption of community identity is a key aim of ethnic violence, and in this case, of sexual violence. So to properly understand the cases of sexual violence against men, you have to ask yourself a little bit about the mechanisms of emasculation that underpin that. It also, sexual violence against men, I think, is interesting because it's never framed as a spoils of war argument, the way that sexual violence against women is. As I've suggested, the spoils of war argument is problematic. I think that's widely agreed to be the case. And I'm not the only person that said that, but it's widely agreed to be problematic when it comes to women. But it's even more problematic in ethnic context and when we're talking about sexual violence against men. So there have been a couple of studies, the Women's Refugee Commission and a few others, that have suggested that the statistics associated with sexual violence against men are quite a bit more than we might have expected. There's a bit of a problem with the data here because most of the data is collected by organizations on the ground that are perceived to have a political bias, that some outside groups suggest are inflating the numbers because they have an incentive to do so. So it can be difficult. On the other hand, there's not a lot of outside observers directly collecting this kind of data, so it's sort of the best we have at the moment. But there have been some refugee focus groups conducted with Rohingya refugees that have attempted to collect more robust data on it. And in most cases, we're seeing pretty high percentages of men who have reported sexual abuse or conflict-related sexual violence. So the study in 2013, they surveyed 70 refugee men, and 14.3% reported experiencing rape, 20% other types of sexual abuse. In 2018, the focus group suggested that 1/3 personally knew a man or boy who had experienced sexual violence. We can presume that perhaps some of the individuals themselves had experienced it, but didn't necessarily want to admit that was the case. And we see from the first bullet point that the victims often frame this not as sexual violence, not as rape, but rather as torture or as genital trauma, which makes it a little bit difficult to, again, properly account for this, properly kind of understand data. It's just interesting because one thing we've seen from studies of perpetrators of rape of women is that they often articulate their own violence, either in the framing of lust, the spoils of war, or in the context of like ownership. And understanding it in ethnic context, we understand it as disrupting the bloodline. For men, there seems to be more strategy involved in who's selected. So the female victims of sexual violence in Myanmar are women of reproductive age. That's pretty much it. There doesn't seem to be more dynamics. In the context of men, it's typically community leaders that are targeted with this type of violence, religious leaders, educated, sometimes elders, sometimes adolescent boys. Those tend to be the individuals that are particularly vulnerable. So I think there's something interesting here about the choice of victims, because it is the individuals that are essentially community leaders that are being targeted with this mechanism of emasculation. And I think that's important. One of the effects that we're seeing of this is that Rohingya women are reporting that men, especially in refugee camps, are becoming more controlling in relationships. We're seeing an increase in intimate partner violence. And some suggest that this is a mechanism of men who have been victims of violence to reassert their masculinity through dominance over their partners. So it's having negative effects on a community that's already fairly effectively been decimated by the violence that's been carried out against them. Oops, too far.
All right.
No, should I? Okay. So just to conclude, I think there's something here in thinking about sexual violence as a strategic tactic and the way it functions to dismantle an identity group or a political group. And part of that is thinking about how sexual violence intersects with other forms of identity, political identity, ethnic identity, gender also as a component. And I think in order to properly do that, you have to understand both violence that targets men and violence that targets women. You have to understand some of the differences and the dynamics associated with it, but also some of the similarities that underpin some of these processes. And I think if we look at the cases where this has been used, which are widespread, hundreds of cases of civil war have utilized this tactic of sexual violence against men. The social effects that it has make it a fairly effective tactic. So there's a reason why groups, governments, militias have continued to adopt this as a tactic. So this is a bit preliminary. As I said, the struggle has been to kind of get some of the data that is out there hiding and sort of miscategorized potentially. But I think asking these sorts of questions about how we should understand this as a strategic tactic is worthy of further research and attention. With that said, that's everything I prepared. So I'm interested in engaging some of the questions you have about this dynamic. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Auchter. I'm going to allow the online audience a few moments to populate their questions. Would anybody in the room like to start off?
Hi, Colonel Ryan Drakowski, the Canadian Armed Forces visiting defense fellow here at Queen's. Thank you very much for that sobering discussion on that definitely reflects experiences that I've had in various regions around the world in both conflict and post-conflict areas. I'm just wondering if you could expand a little bit on what international law and tribunals or the potential for tribunals say about this topic, or what they are considering to not say about the topic, but take action against perpetrators, either individually or who are part of a power structure facilitating this or making this happen. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much. I assume I should answer as opposed to collecting more questions. Thanks so much. I mean, I think most scholars would agree that and most sort of stakeholders would agree that the international community doesn't do a great job of prosecuting sexual violence more generally. So this becomes difficult because often when you're suggesting increased attention should be paid to this issue, people think that it becomes this kind of competitive victimhood sort of idea, given that there's a lack of capacity at the level of international organizations. So I'll just start by saying that. But I think that biggest thing that I've seen across multiple instances like this is that international tribunals define sexual violence against men, even in clear-cut cases, as torture. Previous study that I conducted of forced circumcisions after the Kenyan elections in 2007, which was prosecuted as part of an international criminal court case, suggested that essentially there was an initial attempt to prosecute it as sexual violence, and in the course of the court proceedings, it was recoded as torture or other inhumane acts. And I think part of that is because of what I've been suggesting here, that the stigma exists, but also that there's a perception that men are invulnerable. Men, as I noted at the beginning, men are seen as perpetrators and allies. And it is a bit difficult to suggest they might operate in another category when you're also trying to draw attention to justice mechanisms for male perpetrators of sexual violence against female victims. So it becomes quite difficult when many men are the perpetrators to also properly understand them as victims. So in that case, you had international legal mechanisms and definitions to properly account for the cases of violence in that case, but it wasn't used or applied effectively to denote that definition. And that's why I think the idea that these violations are coded as torture is such an important one, is that it prevents us from being able to have adequate data, which is frustrating for scholars like myself, but also that it is fundamentally a problem of international justice as well. And I've seen much of the same trend in other contexts as well. Part of that has to do with, I mentioned that some of the like psychological assessments that are used on the ground in a post-conflict context specifically target women. But we've seen some trends that are similar to that in international mechanisms of justice as well. And part of that is an unintended consequence of the women, peace, and security agenda that has been advanced in a lot of different sectors, which has had a lot of really positive effects. But one of the kind of negative unintended consequences is that sexual violence is framed as an issue that affects women, and also that sexual violence is framed as a wartime issue, which is actually an issue because most sexual violence against women occurs not during wartime. And often the dynamics are a bit different, but interrelated as well. So there's a few limitations associated with that. It also kind of disproportionately places the burden on women as peacemakers. And so I think you start to get these kind of unintended consequences associated with the elevation of particular issues, even if something has also achieved a lot of really positive things. So I think the international legal mechanisms are there to properly account for this type of violence that targets men, but they're not being applied in a way that effectively accounts for the existence of men as victims. And we've seen the same thing in the context of like civilian evacuations during wartime as well, that men aren't properly coded as civilians, and those kinds of things. So I think it's all part and parcel of the same kind of process.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Martel. I'm a fellow at the CIDP and assistant professor at the Department of Political Studies. Thank you so much for this presentation. It's certainly hard to listen to. It must be very hard as a topic to work on. I get the chance to sit down with you at 3 p.m. today, so I have a bunch of questions for you, so I'll only throw maybe a couple at you right now. One of the questions I had listening to you, and I get that your main contribution seems to be to highlight really the strategic dimension of it all. And I think, it's certainly plausible given how systematic this tactic is. But I wonder if you could tell us more about how you identify strategic intent here, right? Because it's very clear that this is being used as an overall tactic. There's clearly a design to it. But I wonder, given the evidence being predominantly about survivors, right? How are researchers like yourself assessing when it becomes kind of a conscious strategy? Because I doubt that there is, I don't know, but how does the military wishing to use that tactic communicate this as a strategy to the perpetrators? And following up on that, I guess, to what extent is the research on this kind of violence use perpetrators' accounts to reach these conclusions, right? Is this something that is, either missing or being done, and how? I'm really curious about that. And then maybe a second question, and I don't know that there's going to be a lot of data on this, just given the particularities of the cases, but I was listening, to the introduction of your talk, and I was thinking about Laura Herbert's work on women combatants as being also involved in sexual violence against men. I was thinking about the Abu Ghraib case study that she did in particular with a co-author whom I forget the name of. And I'm wondering if there are instances in the cases that you look at, not necessarily of women combatants, because I don't think that Tatanda or others even allow women in their ranks, but if there's a role for women, maybe from the communities that are being victimized as acting as perpetrators of violence against family members or children or something like that. This is especially for some, I believe I'm asking this question, but I'm curious to know whether that's part of the project, or if there are some instances where women are also not only survivors, but also possibly perpetrators, and what are the implications here when thinking about sexual violence against men in these situations. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Excellent questions. Yeah, as you noted, this is a difficult topic to work on. I think my entire research agenda is sort of like that. I study, I'm interested, my research focuses on representations of atrocity, representations of violence. So I sort of, I'm sorry. Yeah. Is that a little bit better? Okay. Yes, my entire research agenda focuses on kind of how violence is represented. And, much of my work has focused on dead bodies. So I sort of have these two research interests, dead bodies and sexual violence, which I think are some of the most difficult things to study. And I frequently get asked by students and others how I maintain such a cheery disposition despite this sort of thing. And that's maybe a topic for another day related to how we get into some of the research projects that we study, and also how we navigate some of those dimensions. But I think that I came to this project because I was interested in the functioning of gender essentialisms, the assumptions we make about masculinity and femininity that structure kind of how we understand violence more broadly. So I think maybe I'll answer your sort of second question first about this, about female perpetrators and that sort of thing. I think it's interesting because a lot of the scholarship that focuses on this kind of question of the norms associated with vulnerability and femininity, invulnerability and masculinity focus a lot on arguing that women can be perpetrators too. And some of my past work has sort of examined some of this and the way in which kind of agency functions to structure the way we think about who can be a political agent, and that you have to engage in violence to be considered an adequate political agent, which I think is a problem. But a lot of the work is focused on suggesting that women aren't only peaceful, that women can engage in violence as well, which I think is an important kind of understanding of it. But it has been met with quite a lot of backlash, that women can't ever be perpetrators, they're only victims. So it's difficult to kind of properly understand some of the dynamics that exist in some of these cases. As hard as it may be to find some of the data about male victims, at least some men are willing to come forward and suggest they've been victims of torture. When it comes to female participation, I've seen almost no data on this associated with that. I think we do know that women when it comes to ethnic violence at least, women who are part of perpetrator communities are often encouraging men to engage in sexual violence, but almost entirely against women of the victim group. I've not seen any studies perhaps they exist, I haven't looked a lot. I haven't seen any studies that have examined the participation of female members of perpetrator ethnic groups with regards to sexual violence against men. But part of that is because when it comes to the Bosnian genocide, for example, it's only in the last few years that information is emerging that suggests that sexual violence against men is a component of that. At the time, there was nothing coming out, no information coming out on that at all. So some of it is as a result of that we just don't have enough information until a lot of time has passed. And even in the Myanmar case, part of the reason we have information is because of tap-down defectors, but there's not that many of them, and not that many of them have spoken to the media. And it's not like scholars have been interviewing them to engage in some of these intense dimensions. So I think, to say, I think that we can probably assume that, especially in ethnic violence or political violence, women who are members of perpetrator communities are actively supporting some of these things and probably participating in some of them, but we don't understand the extent to which that might be happening. I've not heard, I think you asked a bit about whether or not we see women being forced to engage in sexual violence against family members or something like that. I've not seen that. I mean, it depends on how you understand particular acts of sexual violence, I guess, but in most cases, it's men being directed to carry out acts on female family members. And in those scenarios, right, of course, both the men and the women are victims of that sexual violence. But there's also some nuance there to sort of who is actually carrying out the act. And I think I haven't seen anything that suggests that women are being asked to do that in those contexts. For the other component about strategic intent, yeah, that's such a good question. And again, part of the problem is that we don't have that many perpetrator accounts. There is an excellent article about rape as a tactic used in the Congo by Maria Vaz and Maria Stern, who interviewed perpetrators of sexual violence against women, and they kind of like asked them to kind of assess how they understood it. And in those cases, the perpetrators classified rape as either lust rape or evil rape, which is a really interesting dynamic. So they categorize anything that they themselves participated in as lust rape, away from home, spoils of war, kind of your standard arguments. But rape that other people committed was sometimes evil rape. And so they made this sort of distinction. And so I think that's interesting because perpetrators themselves are coding their own acts in the context of this spoils of war argument. But again, sexual violence against men can't be coded in those terms, at least not as easily. I've not heard anyone attempting to do so. So it can't really be understood properly within those because the perpetrators don't want to admit to being gay either. So there's this kind of like homosexuality that rears its head also. So yes, there's limited data, but I think there's also some data we have that suggests that that in military training mechanisms, there is reinforcement of particular understandings of masculinity that does, especially in the Tatmadaw case, that does reinforce kind of ethnic othering and dehumanization to the context that violence and physical violence is encouraged. So we can understand particular kinds of violence as a tactic through those testimonies. It's harder to find specific references to this kind of mass rape, but the accounts of defectors that we have suggests that gang rapes are used as a tactic of unit cohesion. So I think it's more about kind of finding these disparate pieces and attempting to trace it together. It's a lot harder to identify direct evidence of strategic intent. So I think that's why at the moment my conclusions are a bit tentative. I think that there are larger dynamics at play here. So my intent is to seek out, to make this a more comprehensive examination of a variety of different studies, a variety of different cases, some more historical cases like the Bosnian case, where we're seeing more information emerge, because I think if we can understand how it works in a case where we do have a bit more data, perhaps we can extrapolate a bit more from the limited data we have for some of these cases.
Hi, Ian Garner. I'm a researcher of Russian culture and war propaganda, and so much of what you spoke about today is so deeply relevant to what's happening on the front lines in Ukraine today. And the Ukrainian Prosecutor General's office is doing a huge amount of work using social media to try and understand the motivations, the rationale behind these sorts of crimes that are being used to target Ukrainians. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit about how smartphone recordings and social media are being used elsewhere in the world, perhaps the ways in which legal proceedings are being influenced or indeed not being influenced by smartphone recordings elsewhere. And I'm particularly interested because you talk about the lack of evidence, the lack of data. You covered extensively the respondent survey and the victims surveys in these various places. And yet here at the front in Russia, or rather in Ukraine, we see a huge amount of data of Russian soldiers committing sexual violence against men, against boys, against women in this kind of destructive orgy, and spreading this material not just amongst themselves and their units, not just at the front, but also back home to their friends and family and other followers on social media.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I thought a lot about the Ukrainian case for the obvious reasons that it is connected, both in terms of the widespread use of sexual violence against women and then the instances that I've heard of sexual violence against men also. I think that it's sort of an interesting dynamic because you do see many of the same kind of like strategic motivations in that case, the information that we do have about it. But I think that the Ukrainian government has been particularly adept at utilizing social media, like citizen sort of journalism and circulating it to kind of like maintain the story in headlines. They've been quite effective at doing that. The dilemma about sort of smartphone imagery, I think, is that representing sexual violence on any kind of like broad scale is quite difficult. So as I mentioned, I've studied, I recently published a book on dead body images. And I think I talked a lot about the obscenity taboo that exists governing the publication of dead body images, not to suggest that dead body images are never published, but rather that they're published only in extreme circumstances. And I was discussing this with some of my students a couple of weeks ago, and they asked me, like, are there any images of human suffering that just like don't ever get published? And I was like, yeah, sexual violence. That like as much as there is a taboo governing dead body images, the taboo governing sexual violence images is sort of even greater because you both have the extreme violence taboo and the sex taboo. And so I think if we look at how sexual violence is represented on an international scale, it's almost never with like direct representation of victimization. So even though we may have imagery sort of circulating, testimony, like perpetrators taking video themselves, it's really difficult to imagine a way that it reaches any kind of like global distribution sort of mechanism. So that's the first thing about that, is that there's a lot of taboos. There are multiple taboos that exist at the level of representing sexual violence that I think make sexual violence a more sort of tenacious issue when it comes to awareness raising compared to some others. Not to mention we have all these stereotypes about what sexual violence is and what it looks like and who it targets, as I've mentioned. But the sort of other side of the coin is how these kinds of things are utilized as evidence. And I think, my technological sophistication isn't quite there, but there has been an effort for authenticating from a technological perspective for better authentication of not just images of sexual violence coming out of Ukraine, but a lot of other dynamics. Like Human Rights Watch has attempted to authenticate images of killings coming out of Syrian detention centers from the Syrian photographer that defected, Caesar. And in some of those cases, the images that were released depicted genital beatings, and they've been able to document some of those contexts from photographic authentication of the images that the Syrian photographer defector took with him when he left. So I think the biggest problem is that of authenticity when it comes to those functioning as evidence. On the other hand, there's a problem with authenticity for witness statements as well. And I mentioned in my talk that a lot of the focus groups, initially at least, are being led by grassroots organizations who tend to be perceived as less trustworthy than large international humanitarian organizations. So the UNHCR focus groups are perceived as much more trustworthy in the Syrian context, but most of the documentation of sexual violence in Myanmar is by groups that have some sort of connection to some of the resistance organizations in those areas. So witness testimony is often considered problematic as well. We would think that smartphone technology and recording would sort of solve some of that, but it actually kind of reinforces some of the same dynamics because certain voices become elevated as experts and sort of others don't. But I do think that it also provides the opportunity to kind of learn a bit more from the perpetrator perspective. Like Stephanie was asking about that as well. Like, do we have perpetrator accounts? In the Ukraine case, we're starting to have more than we might have seen in other cases because perpetrators are literally recording their own actions. So I think there may still be a problem of authentication, but it may help us understand a bit more some of the unit cohesion dynamics at play, because you don't record something unless you're kind of like a vibrant actor in it. And also we often record ourselves because we want the approval of others. And as you mentioned, the circulation of some of these images to particular groups and networks also reinforces these kind of othering dynamics that I mentioned. So I guess I'll like sort of hedge my bets a bit and say like, this is kind of a wait and see what the dynamics of some of these actually look like. It could provide us more opportunity to shed light on perpetrator accounts, but I suspect that we'll also see a lot of doubt cast on the authenticity associated with some of those accounts as well. And that's the dilemma with those. But that dilemma also exists with witness testimony. So
Professor Auchter, that unfortunately brings to an end this lunch hour session. I'd like to thank you on behalf of everybody here, folks online, as well as the Center for International and Defense Policy and its staff for coming here today and sharing with us your research. I will say I, for one, will be looking at sexual violence and conflict from a completely different perspective after your presentation.
thank you so much. And thank you for having me. And for those in person or online, I've put my email address up. So if you want to follow up with specific questions or comments, then I'd be more than happy to have you reach out. So I really appreciate everyone taking the time to join the talk today, online and in person.